the 5th of January, 1855, a gallows stands built directly onto the Queen Street footpath, right in front of the Brisbane Gaol. A crowd has gathered to watch, settlers on one side of the street, and on the rise of Wickham Terrace overlooking the scene, a large number of Aboriginal people, including the condemned man's own wife. The town's constabulary and a detachment of native police surround the gallows itself, on high alert for any attempt at rescue. As the man climbs the steps to the platform, he calls out, loudly enough for everyone watching to hear, to the people gathered on the hill above him. He tells them who betrayed him. He tells them to avenge his death. His name was Dundalli. For more than a decade, he'd been the single most significant resistance figure the colonial settlement of Brisbane had to deal with. What happened next, on that gallows, did not go quickly or cleanly. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Whadjuk Noongar country, and we acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about Dandalli, a Turrwan, a great leader, chosen under his own people's law to answer settler violence around colonial Brisbane with violence of his own, and the last man ever publicly executed in the entire history of Queensland. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses colonial-era violence, including poisoning, and describes a mismanaged public execution in some detail. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any hour of the day or night, on 13 92 76. Alright, let's go back to who Dundalli actually was and why his own people chose him for the role he ended up filling. Dundalli was born around 1820, most likely into the Dallumbara clan of the Dala language group, in the Blackall Range northwest of Moreton Bay. His name meant Wanga Pigeon. He grew up there with his brother Umuli, in a region of genuine natural wealth, fertile mountain country, waterfalls, and deep gorges that had supported his people for generations, with a rich regional economy built around the seasonal bunya nut harvests that drew multiple language groups together from across the wider district. By most contemporary accounts, including from the judge who eventually sentenced him to death, Dundalli was an extraordinarily large man, well over 6 feet tall, with a presence that made an impression on almost everyone who encountered him, European or Aboriginal, a physical stature that became part of his growing legend among both communities, long before his name was attached to any specific act of violence. In August of 1841, while still a young man in his early 20s, Dundalli took part in a delegation of Dala people who met with German missionaries travelling north from Brisbane, hoping to invite them to set up a mission post on Dala country. One of those missionaries later recorded Dundalli telling him, in essence, that the Dala had seen they weren't liars, that they'd come exactly as they'd promised. Words that say a great deal about how carefully Dundalli was already weighing which colonists could be trusted and which couldn't, years before he became known to history, mainly as a violent threat to colonial settlement. That trust didn't extend very far, because it didn't need to. Squatters, and selectors were already pushing further and further into Aboriginal land around Moreton Bay by the early 1840s, clearing country well beyond the boundaries colonial authorities had actually authorized for settlement. Some of them used a method that's come up before on this show, leaving out flour deliberately poisoned with strychnine for Aboriginal people to find and eat, a quiet, deniable way of clearing a district of its original inhabitants without ever needing to fire a shot, the same basic tactic behind the Kilcoy poisonings that devastated Ningi communities in this exact period. Other settlers simply shot Aboriginal people on sight if they came near stock or crops, with little expectation of ever facing consequences for it. Under Dalla law, and under the law of several neighbouring nations Dundalli came to represent, this kind of violence demanded a response. As a Turrwan, a recognised great leader educated specifically in law, Dundalli was chosen to organise exactly that response, a system of reciprocal justice in which harm done to Aboriginal people had to be answered with harm of roughly equal weight, the same basic principle of proportionate response that underpinned warrior law across much of this continent, and one that colonial observers, looking for a simpler story, almost never bothered trying to understand on its own terms. From 1843 onward, Dundalli's name started turning up in connection with one violent incident after another, as colonial settlement around Moreton Bay continued expanding into country well outside its officially sanctioned limits. He was accused that year of involvement in the spearing of a shepherd at the Archer family's Durandur station, and evaded capture entirely, the first in what would become a 14-year pattern. In 1845, a German missionary testified he'd personally heard Dundalli directing other Aboriginal men as they robbed and then burned down his hut, evidence that, even at the time, relied heavily on a single witness's account of events conducted largely in a language he was still learning. In October of 1846, a mass attack on a station belonging to Andrew Gregor on the Pine River killed Gregor himself, along with his pregnant servant, Mary Shannon, though the attackers deliberately spared her young children and another resident in the household, a detail that suggests considerably more deliberate targeting than the indiscriminate savagery colonial newspapers like to describe. That attack cemented Dundalli's reputation across the colony as the resistance leader most responsible for organised Aboriginal violence in the district, whether or not he was always personally present for every incident later attributed to him, and triggered a wave of settler reprisals and counter-reprisals across the wider region that continued for years afterward. In September of 1847, 3 sawyers were ambushed at the Pine River by Gubby Gubby and Jindubari men. One of them, William Boller, died at the scene. A second, William Waller, died the following day after managing to stagger back toward Brisbane. The following year, in May of 1848, Dundalli's own brother Umuli was captured during a night raid on an Aboriginal camp and killed, a direct, personal cost to exactly the kind of escalating cycle Dundalli had been organising. Further killings followed over the next several years. A fisherman named Charles Gray near Bribie Island, a shepherd named Halloran, alongside a string of robberies and break-ins attributed to Dundalli with varying degrees of actual evidence behind them. Colonial authorities, by this point, were inclined to credit him with practically every act of Aboriginal resistance on the northern side of the Brisbane River, whether the specific evidence supported that or not. What kept Dundalli free for so long wasn't just his own skill at evading capture. Aboriginal communities around Moreton Bay were themselves divided over him, some actively protecting and sheltering him, others, particularly among traditional rivals of the Jindubari people who'd taken him in on Bribie Island, willing to tell colonial authorities exactly where to find him. For close to 14 years, that informal protection held. In May of 1854, it finally didn't. Dundalli was captured at Fortitude Valley, betrayed, by his own account from the gallows, by a man named Wumbungur. His trial took place that November before Justice Roger Therry at the Brisbane Circuit Court. Therry later wrote about Dundalli in his own memoirs, recalling, among other things, that the prisoner had brazenly tried to bribe him with sixpence, and on another occasion offered to personally row him all the way to Sydney in exchange for his release, a strange, almost wry detail that sits oddly alongside everything else in this story. It didn't work. On the 21st of November, 1854, Dundalli was found guilty of the murders of Andrew Gregor and William Bowler and sentenced to death. The execution took place on the 5th of January, 1855, on a gallows built directly onto the Queen Street footpath outside the Brisbane Gaol, on the exact site where the city's General Post Office stands today. In the lead up to the hanging, fear of exactly the kind of reaction Dundalli's stand-in might provoke ran high enough through the colony that many residents reportedly left the city altogether rather than risk being present for it. The town's constabulary and an entire detachment of native police were deployed around the gallows itself, specifically to prevent any attempt at rescue, a sign of just how seriously colonial authorities still took Dundalli's standing among Aboriginal people, even as they prepared to kill him. As he climbed the steps to the platform, Dundalli spotted a settler named Tom Petrie in the crowd, someone he apparently trusted enough to address directly in his own language, and called out across the street to the much larger gathering of Aboriginal people watching from the rise of Wickham Terrace, among them his own wife, since by most accounts Dundalli was a married man and likely a father. Different accounts of exactly what he said vary slightly, naming the man who'd betrayed him, urging his people to keep fighting the colonists, or both, the kind of detail that tends to blur depending on which side of the street the person recording it that day happened to be standing on. When his body finally dropped, the crowd on the hill let out a single, loud cry together, audible across the entire street. The execution itself was badly bungled. The hangman, a former convict named Alexander Green, sent specifically from Sydney for the occasion, had by then carried out almost 500 executions over a 27-year career, and still managed to get this one wrong. Dundalli's feet landed on his own coffin rather than dropping clear, and Green was forced to physically bend down and pull on the hanged man's legs to finish the strangulation properly, in full view of the assembled crowd. It remains the last official public execution ever carried out in the colony, and later, the state of Queensland. For well over a century afterward, Dundalli's name survived, mostly in exactly the framing the colony had given him at the time: a murderer, a savage, a violent criminal who'd terrorised early Brisbane for over a decade, the same simple, one-sided story told about most Aboriginal resistance leaders across this entire continent in the colonial and early 20th century record. It's only in recent decades that serious historical work, including a detailed biography by historian Libby Connors titled Warrior, and research by Dr. Dale Kerwin examining Dundalli specifically as one of this country's overlooked Aboriginal heroes, has properly reconstructed him as what his own people understood him to be all along, a Turrwan, operating under a coherent, recognised system of law, organising a measured, reciprocal response to settler violence that had already included poisoning, shooting, and the destruction of entire communities. Connors's research in particular has traced, incident by incident, just how much of what colonial newspapers attributed to Dundalli personally was actually carried out by other men entirely, with his name simply attached afterward, because by the late 1840s, any act of Aboriginal resistance anywhere near Brisbane tended to get credited to the single most famous Aboriginal name colonists already knew. That reassessment reached an official government level only very recently. In January of 2023, the Queensland government formally declared the 5th of January each year Dundalli Remembrance Day, with the responsible minister at the time describing it explicitly as a truth-telling story of state significance tied directly to the state's broader path to treaty process and a planned referendum on a national Indigenous voice to Parliament. The same minister spoke about embracing the spirit of Dundalli as a freedom fighter, ordained by his own people's law to protect his lands and waters, language that would have been unimaginable from any Queensland government official at almost any other point in the preceding 168 years. Less than 2 years later, after that voice referendum failed and a change of state government followed at the October 2024 election, Queensland's Path to Treaty Act was formally repealed, and the truth-telling and healing inquiry that had grown out of it was wound up entirely, its planned December hearings cancelled outright. The new Premier framed the decision as one made with what he called respect and decency, while redirecting the associated funding toward more immediate, practical service delivery instead. The inquiry's own chair described being notified of the repeal by email, with no advance meeting offered despite repeated requests, and Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner called the reversal a major step backwards for First Nations rights in the state, a near identical pattern to the one we've already covered on this show, happening around the exact same time in Tasmania. The Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance Group has continued commemorating Dundalli regardless, gathering every January at Post Office Square in Brisbane, the same ground where the gallows once stood, with or without the state government's official participation. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. A Turrwan, chosen under his own people's law to answer years of shooting and poisoning with a measured campaign of his own. 14 years evading capture, protected by some of his own people and betrayed, eventually, by others. A trial that included an attempted sixpence bribe to the presiding judge. An execution so badly managed the hangman had to drag the dying man's legs down by hand to finish the job. And, 168 years later, a single year of official state recognition, followed almost immediately by a government reversing course entirely on the broader truth-telling process that recognition was supposed to be part of. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with how quickly that one good year arrived and then disappeared. A government minister stood up in 2023 and called Dundalli a freedom fighter, a phrase his own trial judge would have found incomprehensible. Less than 2 years later, a different government shut down the entire process that recognition belonged to, citing the need to focus on more practical, tangible outcomes instead, as though truth-telling and practical outcomes were somehow in competition with each other rather than connected. Dundalli's story has now survived one full reversal of official memory, and very recently, the partial unwinding of a second one. The warriors of the Aboriginal resistance group showing up at Post Office Square every January, regardless of which government is in office, is, in its own way, the clearest evidence available that this particular story was never actually dependent on state recognition to keep mattering in the first place. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a Three Brothers production. I'll see you next time.